Well, there was another day of strike action in France Tuesday, but after 2 months of protests against the new pension reform, the number of people who turned out on the streets yesterday was far less than last week. Unions, though, still calling for a new strike on April 6th. In the meantime, the French Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, says the door is still open for talks with the union. The French Transport Minister, though, says there'll be no second vote on the pension reform law.
Il ne s'agit pas, encore une fois, de revoter une loi qui a été votée.
There will not be a second vote on this law. It has indeed been forced through, but that is allowed by Parliament.
Qui est parlementaire. L'idée n'est pas d'avoir un deuxième débat parlementaire.
The idea isn't to have another parliamentary debate, but many topics will be up for discussion.
Plein de sujets qui peuvent être évoqués.
Vous parlez de respect des
Si on me dit vous ne pouvez pas en parler.
If they tell me I'm not allowed to speak about the retirement age, either they or I will leave the room.
Ils sortiront de la salle ou alors on partira. Moi j'irai en expliquant pourquoi.
I'll explain to them why this reform is a dead end, why it's so heavily opposed, why it's unjust, and that we need a fair way out that doesn't demonize the protesters.
Aujourd'hui de la part du gouvernement sur le pourrissement d'un mouvement social.
The pension reform that was pushed through the Parliament still needs to be approved by France's Constitutional Council, and we have just learned that the much-awaited verdict on the constitutionality of the legislation will come out April 14th. The opposition is hoping the Council will rule against the reform because of how it was forced through Parliament without a vote. Well, to talk more now about the situation here in France, let's bring in French politics expert Ariane Bogain at Northumbria University. Ariane, thanks so much for joining us. Let's just start with that Constitutional Council. Do you think that there is any way that it might indeed rule against what we saw go through with this pension reform law as the opposition hopes?
It's very difficult to predict. I've been reading about it, and you have all people who are saying yes, others are, constitutionalists, specialists who are saying yes, others who are saying no. I think the consensus is that the whole text is not likely to be rejected, but some elements in the text might well be rejected. But we'll have to see, because it's a legal decision, it's not a political decision. So we'll have to see. My gut feeling is it won't be rejected as a whole text, but part of the text will be rejected, but not the main part, which is the legal age.
All right, so let's say that's what happens. What would happen after that? Do the unions really have any leg to stand on if the law has already been passed and approved?
Yes, that's exactly what happened in 2006. The law was passed, approved, enacted, and protests continued until Jacques Chirac, at the time who was the president, backed down. And they were able to do that through mass protest and by putting the country at a standstill, which is similar to what happened in Israel in the last couple of days. So you can stop a law, but you have to have far more people in the street than yesterday. And more importantly, you really need to try to put the country at a standstill. And that's what the unions so far have not been able to do. But you can carry on, protesting if you think that you have the numbers to force a government to withdraw a law. So it's not just because it becomes a law doesn't mean you can't stop fighting it.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the protests yesterday. The numbers were down to what we've seen in the past, but there was one interesting development. It seemed there were more students, more young people who turned out yesterday to protest. Do you think that could be a turning point at all, despite the fact there are fewer protesters overall, that young people could do something to change?
Well, it's certainly something that the government won't have liked, because there are two categories of people that any French government do not want to see in the street. It's farmers on the one hand and students on the other hand. So yes, for the past week and a half, we have seen an increase in student number, and that is worrying for the government, because if it spreads, it's really difficult traditionally to stop student protest. And they will bring with them not just the issue of the pension, but a raft of other issues. However, we have to be careful, because yes, the numbers were higher, but it's still not a mass movement. So we'll have to check next week, if there is a vast increase. But if they do increase, if we start having universities being closed down, if we have, if we start seeing, lycéens or university students on the street, it might change, the way this movement is going. But it's too early to tell.
Ariane, I just kind of want to take a step back and give some context to our foreign viewers who might live in countries around the world where the retirement age is already 65, even 67 or older. It's probably the same there in the UK where you are. They're probably saying to themselves, 64 is not so bad. Why are the French so against it?
But basically, it's not. Most people know that because of demography, there is a problem with the system, and it needs to be sorted out. But they just oppose the way it was done, and they oppose the fact that it has fallen disproportionately on the shoulders of manual workers, people who started working early, and will have to retire later when their life expectancy, once they reach retirement age, is already much lower than other categories. So they are opposing this particular reform, the way it was done. They're not opposed to changes to the system, but to that particular one, because no one else is been asked to contribute. Companies are not asked. Current retired people are not asked. So it's the feeling of injustice that is fueling the movement.
Just to wrap up, Ariane, how do you see this developing? Is now this pension reform basically a done deal? If the mobilization dies down, is the government still facing a very big political crisis?
Yeah, as usual, we'll have to see the numbers next week. It might die down if the union is not able to really put pressure by putting the country at a standstill. But even if it dies down, this movement is another big political crisis, and the government and the executive will not be able to carry on as if nothing has happened, because this movement has brought back to the fore long-standing issues that we saw with the Yellow Vest, that we saw with other movements, which is, distrust in politics, distrust in institutions seen as too aloof and too brutal, the desire to be heard, the desire to be consulted more. And this is a national discussion that will have to happen at one point. What kind of democracy do we want in France? What kind of institutional framework do we want? Do we need a Sixth Republic, or do we need major reform in the Fifth Republic? So whatever happens with this movement, the political and institutional crisis will still be there.
All right, Ariane, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us. French politics expert Ariane Bogain, thank you.